Eleanor stepped into her father Paul's old house after 10 years of estrangement, her hand tightly gripping Clement, her 12-year-old son with bright but quiet eyes. The air was thick with the smell of rotting wood and stale tobacco, pulling her back to the day her father had thrown her out, a newborn babe in her arms. Before she could even sit, Felicity, her older sister, snapped, "She doesn't deserve to be here." Dad hated her. Harold, her uncle, smirked and pointed at Clement. "The kid knows his mom's a piece of trash." Eleanor's heart clenched, but she forced a smile for her son. Why had she come? A mysterious envelope from Paul, delivered after his death, had dragged her back. Was it forgiveness inside, or one final stab from the father she'd once loved? Eleanor sat down on the creaky old wooden chair at the end of the table, its groan echoing like a warning in the suffocatingly silent room. Clement pressed close to her side, his small hands clasped tightly together, his eyes darting around as if trying to memorize every cold face turned toward them. The air in Paul's old house hung heavy, the scent of rotting wood mingling with the sharp sting of stale tobacco, a smell she remembered vividly from her childhood, when her father would sit silently by the fireplace, saying nothing to her. Now, she'd returned not for any hope of inheritance, but because of a mysterious envelope sent after his death, bearing no message, only Paul's trembling handwriting. What did it hold? An explanation, a shred of leftover affection, or just one final knife from the father who'd once turned his back on her? She didn't know, but the hostile glares from Felicity and Harold made her feel like she'd stepped into an arena, armed with nothing but a trembling heart. The lawyer, Raymond, entered, his thin frame clad in a faded gray suit, his tired eyes hidden behind round glasses. He set his leather briefcase on the table, opening it with a dry click, and pulled out a thick stack of papers, Paul's will. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if reading a shopping list rather than words that would decide a family's fate. "I, Paul Edward Grayson, being of sound mind, declare as follows." Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to focus on her breathing instead of the icy stares piercing her from around the room. She knew she wasn't welcome, but Felicity's shout from when she'd first arrived still echoed in her mind, "She doesn't deserve to be here." Dad hated her. And Harold, with his venomous smirk, "The kid knows his mom's a piece of trash." Their words stabbed at her chest like needles, but she couldn't let Clement see her break. She smiled at him, though the smile felt as fragile as a dry leaf about to crumble. Raymond began reading the distribution of assets, his voice droning like the ticks of a dying clock. "To my eldest daughter, Felicity Grayson, I leave the main house at 14 Oakwood Road, along with the entire collection of paintings and furniture within." Felicity straightened, her red lips curling into a triumphant smile. She glanced at her husband, Robert, who nodded back with blatant satisfaction, as if they'd already planned to repaint the living room walls the moment they left. Eleanor's stomach twisted, not from jealousy, but from realizing that house, where she'd played as a child, where she'd sat with her father as he told stories of far-off travels, now belonged to the sister who'd always seen her as an enemy. But she had no time to sink into the pain, because Raymond's voice pressed on, "To my brother, Harold Grayson, I leave the Grayson farm on the outskirts, along with all shares in the family company." Harold slammed his hand on the table, the thud startling Clement. "Fair's fair," he growled, his voice raspy from too many cigarettes. He sneered, revealing stained yellow teeth, then turned to Eleanor with a look of pure contempt. "No one's expecting anything for a dropout like you, kid," he said, loud enough for her to hear. Eleanor bit her lip, tasting the faint tang of blood. She wanted to scream, to say she hadn't dropped out, she'd been pushed out, the door slammed in her face by her own father when she'd begged for help with a newborn Clement in her arms. But she said nothing. She couldn't. Not out of fear, but because she knew her words would fall into the void, swallowed by the hostility surrounding her. Raymond flipped to the next page, his hands hesitating slightly before continuing. "And as per my prior wishes, my second daughter, Eleanor Grayson, shall receive no portion of my estate." The words dropped like a stone, crushing her chest. She heard Felicity's stifled laugh, soft but sharp enough to slice through the air. Harold nodded, twirling an unlit cigar between his fingers like a trophy. "Told you," Felicity whispered to Robert, loud enough for Eleanor to catch. She thought she could waltz back in and get something? Delusional. Robert chuckled, patting his wife's shoulder as if applauding a perfect performance. Eleanor bowed her head, staring at her trembling hands in her lap. She felt erased, as if her 38 years of life had never existed in her father's eyes. But then she felt Clement's small hand squeeze hers under the table, warm and steady. She looked up, meeting his gaze, not fear, but a strange resolve, as if he knew something she didn't. "Are we done here, Raymond?" Harold asked, his voice impatient, clearly eager to wrap this up and celebrate his victory elsewhere. Raymond nodded, starting to gather his papers, but Eleanor couldn't move. She sat there, feeling her body dissolve into the cold wooden chair. What had she hoped for? A line in the will, some small token from her father, a worn watch, a book he'd once read to her? But there was nothing. Only the same absolute silence from Paul as the day he'd shut the door on her, leaving her in the rain with a wailing Clement in her arms. She whispered to herself, so quiet only she could hear, "Why did I even come?" But then Clement looked up, his eyes blazing in the room's dim light. "Don't be sad, Mom," he said, his voice soft as a breeze. "It's not over yet." Eleanor frowned, confused. Not over? The will was clear, she'd been cut out, erased from the family like a stain on an old rug. But Clement's gaze didn't waver, and in that moment, she felt a tiny, fragile spark of hope, flickering like a flame in the wind. She didn't know that her small son held a secret Paul had entrusted to him, one that would shake this room to its core. As Felicity stood, grabbing her bag with smug arrogance, and Harold began whistling a cheerful tune, Eleanor had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, would be turned upside down. The mysterious envelope she'd received wasn't just an invitation, it was a key to the truth, and Clement, with his quiet courage, would be the one to unlock it. Eleanor sat motionless, her hand still gripping the edge of the chair, her gaze drifting toward Clement, who had just whispered something that made her heart skip a beat. "It's not over yet." She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could open her mouth, Clement sprang to his feet, small but resolute, like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. His hands trembled as he pulled an old, worn envelope from his backpack, its edges frayed as if it had been preserved through long, endless days. Scrawled across the front, in Paul's shaky handwriting, were the words, "To the lawyer, only open if they trample Eleanor." The room seemed to tilt, not from the wind, but from the weight of every pair of eyes suddenly fixed on the 12-year-old boy standing at the center of the storm. "What is this?" Felicity shrieked, her voice cracking like shattered glass. She lunged forward, clutching her purse as if it were her last shield against an unseen threat. "The kid's making it up. Where did he get that?" Harold, still seated at the head of the table, slammed his hand down on the wood, making the glass cups rattle. "Sit down, kid. Don't pull any stunts." But Clement didn't waver. He looked straight at Raymond, his eyes blazing with a certainty Eleanor had never seen before. "Grandpa gave it to me," he said, his voice small but resounding like a vow. "He told me to keep it, and to bring it out only if they hurt my mom." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her chest. She looked at Clement, then at the envelope, her heart pounding as if it might burst. Paul gave it to him? When? Why didn't she know about this? Raymond raised a hand, his voice calm but carrying a new weight. "Let me see it." Clement stepped forward, placing the envelope in his hands with the care of someone handling a precious gem. The room seemed to shrink, the dim light from the old chandelier illuminating the envelope, highlighting the faded black ink. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, not from fear, but from a premonition that something monumental was about to unfold, something that would tear apart the curtain of lies this family had built around her. Raymond opened the envelope, the sound of ripping paper slicing through the silence like a cut. Inside was a tiny black USB drive, so simple it seemed almost harmless, and a folded scrap of paper with a few handwritten lines. He skimmed the note, his brows furrowing tightly, then looked up at the room. "This is Paul Grayson's wish," he said, his voice lowering. "He instructed me to open it if the will reading turned into, as he wrote, an execution." "An execution of what?" Felicity screamed, her hair spilling loose from its perfect bun, revealing a rare glimpse of panic. He never mentioned this. It's a fake. She pointed at Clement, her eyes sharp as knives. Who told you to do this? Who's behind you? But Clement just shook his head, standing firm like a small rock in a raging flood. Eleanor wanted to pull him back, to wrap him in her arms and shield him from those venomous words, but she couldn't move. She was trapped in her son's gaze, a gaze free of fear, brimming with a fierce belief that he was doing the right thing. I'm not lying, he said, his voice steady. Grandpa told me to bring it here because Mom deserves to hear the truth. The truth. The word landed like a stone in a still lake, sending ripples through the room. Eleanor felt her eyes sting, not from tears, but from a strange sensation rising in her chest, a tiny, sharp spark of hope she'd buried long ago. She remembered the last time she'd seen Paul, standing behind a locked door, silent to her desperate knocks. She'd thought he hated her, thought he'd agreed with Felicity that she was a failure, a traitor to the family. But if Clement was telling the truth, if Paul had given him this envelope, what did it mean? Had he thought of her, kept a piece of himself to send her, even if only through a scrap of paper and a USB drive? Raymond held the USB, his fingers brushing its plastic surface as if it might ignite at any moment. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Felicity, then Harold, and finally Eleanor. I'll review its contents, he said, his voice no longer flat but tinged with gravity. He stepped to a small side table where an old laptop waited. As he plugged in the USB, a faint green light flickered, like the heartbeat of a secret waiting to be unleashed. Felicity lunged forward, trying to stop him. No. You can't. But Harold, for the first time that afternoon, held her back, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Let's see what it is, he growled, though his earlier confidence had waned. Eleanor looked at Clement, her heart seeming to stop. Where did you get this? She whispered, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes glowing in the dim light. Last summer, when you were working the night shift, I snuck over to Grandpa's with the neighbor. He sat with me all afternoon, talking about you, about how strong you were to leave to protect me. He paused, his voice catching. He cried, Mom. He said he was wrong, and he wanted you to know. Eleanor felt the ground beneath her crumble. Paul cried? The man who'd shut the door in her face, who'd called her a disgrace, had cried for her. She wanted to ask more, but the laptop screen lit up, and a small click sounded as Raymond pressed play. The room fell silent, save for Felicity's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of Eleanor's heart. Clement returned to his seat, his hand grasping hers, not for comfort, but to lend her strength. Eleanor squeezed back, feeling the warmth of his small fingers, a reminder that she wasn't alone. She didn't know what awaited on that screen, but Clement's unwavering gaze made her believe that, whatever it was, it would change everything. As the screen's light illuminated Raymond's face, Eleanor felt an invisible wave swell in the room, a wave called truth, ready to sweep away every lie this family had constructed. The first image hit, and Eleanor felt the world tilt. Paul, her father, sat there, not in the familiar living room with its fireplace and old wood smell, but in a stark, cold hospital room. Tubes snaked around his nose, his gaunt hands rested on a metal table, and his eyes, once sharp as steel, were red-rimmed, glistening with a sorrow she'd never seen. He stared straight into the camera, his raspy voice weak but cutting through the air like a blade. Eleanor, if you're seeing this, it means I knew they were tearing you apart again. I'm sorry for everything. Eleanor felt like someone was choking her. That voice, the one that had yelled at her, gone silent when she begged, now trembled with regret. She glanced at Clement, sitting close, his eyes blazing as they followed the screen, as if he knew what was coming. Paul coughed, a dry, brittle sound like leaves crunching underfoot, then continued, I let them manipulate me, Eleanor. Felicity and Harold, they came every day, filling my head with lies. Felicity said you were an addict, that you abandoned the family for your ego. Harold said you weren't worth a dime, that kicking you out was the right thing. I believed them because I was stupid, because I was weak. He paused, his trembling hand wiping a tear rolling down his cheek. Eleanor heard Felicity hiss from behind, lies. He never said that. But her voice faltered, swept away by an unstoppable wind. Paul looked up, his gaze piercing through the screen, as if seeing straight into Eleanor's soul. "The day you came to the house with Clement in your arms, I did the worst thing of my life," he said, his voice breaking. "You knocked, crying, begging for help. I stood behind the door, watching you through the crack, saw you holding that boy in the rain, but I didn't open it. I heard you call Dad, and I still turned away. I was a coward, Eleanor." A sob escaped Eleanor's throat, unstoppable. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling like a dam bursting. Paul had seen her? He'd heard her cry, watched her desperate in the freezing rain, but chose silence? Her heart shattered, not from anger, but from the pain of the truth. Her father had been so close, yet so cruelly distant. The room seemed to quake, not physically, but in Eleanor's mind. A chair scraped as Harold shot to his feet, face red, shouting, "Enough. Turn that garbage off." But Raymond raised a hand, his eyes icy. "This is Paul's final wish." No one interrupts. On the screen, Paul pressed on, his voice stronger, as if summoning every ounce of life left. "I know you didn't abandon the family, Eleanor. You left to protect Clement, to give him a life I couldn't give you. You're stronger than I ever dreamed. But Felicity and Harold wanted me to believe you were a traitor so they could take everything. They threatened me, said if I didn't cut you out, they'd make my life hell." He gave a bitter laugh. "They didn't expect I'd have one last shred of conscience." Eleanor heard Felicity's ragged breathing, like a cornered animal. She lunged toward the table, arm raised as if to snatch the laptop, but Robert pulled her back, muttering something through gritted teeth. Paul didn't stop. He leaned closer to the camera, his red eyes locked on her. "I recorded this 3 days before I died, when I knew I didn't have long. I changed the will, Eleanor. The river house, where you used to love fishing with me, is yours. The savings, Clement's college fund, it's all for you too. Felicity and Harold get nothing more. They've taken enough with their lies." A sharp no burst from Felicity, piercing like a bird's nest breaking, but Paul ignored it, his voice softening. "I love you, Eleanor. I'm proud you're the mother I never deserved to be a father to." The world seemed to melt around her. Tears streamed down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable. Paul loved her? He was proud of her? Those words stabbed her chest, painful yet sweet. She looked at Clement, saw him smile, a small, quiet smile, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Paul coughed again, his voice fading. "Clement, thank you. You visited me, listened to my stories, and never once blamed me. You reminded me Eleanor was still my daughter." He paused, his breathing ragged, then whispered, "Live well, my girl. Don't let them take your light." The screen went black, no sound, no transition, just a void as deep as Eleanor's heart. Her sobs broke free, uncontainable. She pulled Clement into her arms, feeling his warmth like a fire thawing her frozen heart. "He saw you," he whispered, voice thick. "He always saw you." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, clutching him like he was the last thread tying her to Paul. A chair crushed, Felicity stormed out, her heels pounding the floor like drums of defeat. Harold slumped back, hands cradling his head, his face ashen. The others, distant relatives, Paul's old friends, watched her quietly, some bowing their heads, some murmuring indistinctly. Eleanor didn't care. All she heard was Paul's voice echoing in her mind, "I love you." 3 simple words, heavy as the world, erasing 10 years of loneliness, 10 years of being invisible. She kissed Clement's forehead, tears falling into his hair, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't reply, just squeezed her hand, as if saying he'd always be there, as Paul had been, however late. As the screen's light faded completely, the room fell still, not the silence of hostility anymore, but of truth, of love, and of a new beginning dawning before her. But the silence didn't last. A sharp scream tore through the air, like glass shattering under a heel. Felicity lunged toward the table, her face twisted, her once perfect red lips trembling like a gash. "No! It can't be," she wailed, grabbing her purse and hurling it to the floor, sending lipstick and keys scattering. It's fake. He couldn't do this to me. She whirled on Raymond, her eyes blazing as if to burn him down. What did you do? You're behind this, aren't you? But Raymond just shook his head, his hands resting on the papers, his voice calm to the point of coldness. I'm only carrying out Mr. Paul's wishes, Mrs. Felicity. The video has a timestamp and legal signature. There's nothing to dispute. Felicity staggered back, her breathing ragged, like a cornered animal. Robert, her husband, stood and tried to pull her out, but she yanked her arm free, screaming, I took care of him. I was there, not her. She doesn't deserve it. Eleanor heard the words, but they no longer cut. They brushed past her like a breeze, unable to pierce the invisible wall Paul had built around her with his final words. She lifted her head, meeting Felicity's gaze, not with anger, but with an odd calm. For the first time that afternoon, she felt she didn't need to shrink, didn't need to apologize for existing. Harold, at the head of the table, suddenly slammed his hand down, the thud ringing like thunder. What the hell is this? He roared, his flushed face turning purple. I poured my sweat into that farm. Paul can't backstab me like this. He jabbed a finger at Eleanor, his voice quaking with rage. What did you do, huh? You walked out, you were nothing, and now you take everything? But his words lacked weight. They fell to the floor, useless as the debris from Felicity's bag. Raymond stood, his thin frame suddenly commanding in the dim light of the room. Let me reiterate, he said, his voice sharp as steel. Mr. Paul amended his will 3 days before his death, witnessed by 2 independent parties. The River House, the savings account, and Clement's college fund belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. That cannot be changed. He paused, his gaze sweeping over Felicity and Harold before settling on Eleanor. Mrs. Grayson, I'll prepare the paperwork for you to sign after this. Eleanor nodded, but she barely heard him. She was adrift in an ocean of emotions, where waves of recognition and love from Paul carried her, gentle yet fierce. The room began to unravel. Felicity, after one last scream, bolted for the door, her heels pounding the hallway like drums of defeat. Robert chased after, muttering something, but no one cared. Harold stayed seated, hands cradling his head, his face a torn painting, his former arrogance now just ashes. The others, distant relatives, Paul's old friends, started to rise, some slipping out quietly with bowed heads, others glancing at Eleanor with unreadable looks, as if trying to reconcile her with the lies they'd heard from Felicity. An older woman, perhaps a friend of Eleanor's mother, paused beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder and whispering, I didn't know, Eleanor. I'm sorry. But Eleanor only smiled, a fragile but genuine smile. She didn't need apologies. She had what she needed, not the River House, not the money, but 3 words from Paul, I love you. Clement looked up at her, his eyes shining in the faint light. You okay, Mom? He asked, his voice small but full of care. Eleanor pulled him close, hugging him tight as if he were the only light in her long darkness. I'm okay, she whispered, her voice thick. Because of you, and because of him. She kissed his forehead, feeling the warmth of his soft hair, and in that moment, she saw Paul, not the cold father who'd shut the door, but the man in the video, who'd cried for her, who'd righted his wrongs with his last strength. She wasn't angry anymore. Her heart swelled with a tender love, like the river by the house he'd left her, quiet but endless. When everyone had gone, leaving only Eleanor, Clement, and Raymond in the vast room, sunlight slipped through the old curtains, casting warm golden streaks across the wooden floor. Raymond gathered his papers, his voice softening, Mrs. Grayson, I'll contact you to finalize everything. But I want to say, Mr. Paul was meticulous with this video. He wanted to be sure you heard it. Eleanor nodded, silent, but inside, a door had opened, not the one Paul had once closed, but one leading to peace. She stood, took Clement's hand, and walked out of the room, not as an outcast, but as someone who'd reclaimed herself. Their footsteps echoed on the wood, light but steady, like the beat of a new beginning. The sound of Felicity's heels faded into the distance, blending with Robert's panicked whispers, leaving behind a stillness that, for the first time in 10 years, didn't feel suffocating to Eleanor. Harold had left too, his figure disappearing through the door with the posture of a man who'd just lost the throne he once sat upon so arrogantly. But Eleanor didn't watch them go, didn't care about the averted gazes or the final murmurs of the dispersing crowd. She only heard Clement's steady breathing beside her, and in her mind, Paul's raspy voice echoed like a melody that never ended, "Live well, my girl." Those 3 words, like seeds sprouting in her heart, took root in the barren soil of years forgotten. She bent down, looking into Clement's blazing eyes, where a steadfastness shone unlike anything she'd seen in anyone else. "You know," she whispered, her voice trembling but warm, "you're the light he talked about." Clement smiled, not the smile of a 12-year-old boy, but of someone who'd placed the world in his mother's hands. He said nothing, just tilted his head to rest on her shoulder, his soft hair brushing her cheek like a wordless comfort. Eleanor felt a warm wave rise in her chest, not tears this time, but something greater, a sense of wholeness, as if every broken piece of her life had finally found its place. Paul hadn't just left her the river house or money, he'd left her a bridge back to herself, and Clement was the one keeping that bridge from collapsing. Raymond approached, his hands gently setting the papers on the table, his eyes softer than ever. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, his voice low like water flowing over stones, "I'll send the documents to you tomorrow. But I want you to know, Mr. Paul prepared that video with all his heart. He told me you were the only one he owed an explanation to." Eleanor nodded, her lips pressed together to hold back a smile, not from pride, but from feeling the weight of a love her father had hidden too long. "Thank you," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. Raymond smiled, a rare smile that lit up his stern face, then left silently, leaving the space to her and her son. Eleanor led Clement out of the room, each step light but steady, as if walking a newly drawn path under the afternoon sun. A breeze slipped through the open door, carrying the fresh scent of grass from the garden behind, a smell she remembered from childhood, when she and Paul would sit by the river, casting lines and laughing in the sunlight. Now, that river house was hers, not just a place to live, but a promise she'd never have to run again. She paused at the threshold, turning for one last look at the room. Golden light still danced on the floor, like tiny spirits bidding farewell to the past. "Let's go home," she said to Clement, and for the first time, home wasn't a distant dream in her mind. As they stepped outside, the sky stretched wide above, deep blue and clear, as if breathing with her. Eleanor tilted her face up, letting the cool breeze caress her, and in that moment, she felt Paul somewhere, not in old reproaches, but in the sunlight, the wind, in Clement's embrace. She'd won, not by defeating Felicity or Harold, but by finding herself, by letting truth illuminate the dark corners she'd once feared. They walked hand in hand, their shadows stretching long on the narrow path, like a complete picture, no longer scattered pieces, but a story of love, courage, and healing. The story, a voice from the past of Eleanor carries profound messages. Truth will always find a way to shine through despite being hidden, family love can heal old wounds, and the courage of the younger generation can alter destinies. For the elderly, the lesson is not to let regrets pile up, speak words of love and make amends while you still can, as Paul did through his video. Though the past may be painful, as Eleanor experienced, you can still reclaim your worth through loved ones, as Clement did for his mother. Cherish time, listen to your children and grandchildren, and believe it's never too late to leave a legacy of forgiveness and hope. Life, at any age, remains worth living when we dare to face and heal.